The former BBC broadcaster Huw Edwards has avoided a jail sentence today, having admitted accessing indecent images of children. Instead, he's received a suspended sentence and has been put on the sexual offenders register, but some are up in arms, believing that this sentencing is far too lenient. I'm Natasha Feroze. I'm the Spectator's deputy broadcast editor, and to discuss the sentencing and child sexual abuse more broadly, I am joined by Emma Jane Taylor, who is a survivor of child sexual abuse. She also set up Project 9010. Emma Jane Taylor, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. I wanted to start off with, what were your first reactions to the sentencing today?
Well, there was no sentence. All I kept hearing about in the reporting was poor Hugh Edwards, his mental health, poor Hugh Edwards. How is he going to work now? Poor Hugh Edwards, what's going to happen? Poor Hugh Edwards. And it went on and on. And that is actually quite sickening. They talk about his mental health. Why is Edwards any different? He should have consequences. He got a light tap on the hands with a feather and he went home for his tea. Ludicrous in every sense. He's been told he has to take, I believe, 25 rehabilitation sessions. To me, that is clearly suggesting that the judge sees that there is a risk to him potentially reoffending. And in my opinion, the fact he offended in the first place suggests just that. He can reoffend again. So let's not pussyfoot around that reality. It was sickening to have heard all that I heard and to have seen the end result, which quite frankly was just nothing.
It is quite common that a perpetrator wouldn't receive a custodial sentence for cases like these. And reading up on it, some lawyers have said that because he had no previous convictions and also because he entered an early guilty plea, these sort of sentences are quite common. What do you think his sentence should have been?
Well, I'm not going to beat about the bush on this. I think, when you consider the damage that any a child abuse does to a child and the life that it takes from a child, I seriously believe that any sentencing should match that, which should be, for me, for life. If you're going to hurt a child in this way, take a life from a child, because this child isn't going to just get over it with 12 weeks of therapy. They are going to suffer immensely because of what Edwards did. And we need to nurture children, right? Not tear them apart, not tear them apart by selfish behavior. From experience, I can tell you that I suffered big parts of my life with abreactions, eating disorders, addictions, maladaptive daydreaming, paranoia, delayed onset of maturity, and a list that just goes on and on and on. And so why should Edwards go home for tea when now the child involved in this case will have a lifelong trauma to manage? And that's putting it lightly. And not only that, this green light's a very dangerous situation for other children and abusers watching on, right?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your own experience and how that has brought up, this case has brought up all these feelings for you. Do you think that also part of the problem when these trials go on is that because they're trying to protect the children, there's so much anonymity surrounding who these children are that actually they don't have their voices heard in the way that they probably should, so that the lessons can be learnt?
I think that there's all sorts of different conversation threads that could come from what you were just saying there. But if I talk about my own experience, I watch on in horror to these cases because, I know as a child what I endured because of selfish behaviours towards me as a child, the abuse that I endured from 9-3 to 16 because of the selfish hands of adults, and the fallout that had on my own life and everything that I just shared before is what I went through. So when you're looking on, of course, you want to give victims anonymity because you're talking about underdeveloped children. Now, underdeveloped children need nurturing. You start abusing young children, not only should you continue that anonymity, but you should make it about the child even more so now. And that should reflect on the sentencing, this conversation, and the future of any kind of abuse towards children in any way, shape, or form. And it doesn't. It doesn't. The justice system to me is just so poor. It's not reflecting the reality of what children are going through. I mean, what are we going to see here? I mean, in I'm a Celebrity with Schofield in a few months. I mean, that's how it's being played out. It's being played out in a really tragic way, and not the seriousness of this case is not being acknowledged in any way at all.
Where do you think the flaws with managing justice for sexual abuse cases come into play? Obviously, we talk a lot on this show about policing. I just want to read out to you a couple of cases. We have Lucy Connolly, who has been told that she'll receive a substantial sentence for publishing written material to stir up racial hatred during the Southport riots. Similarly, another person who was falsely claimed on a live stream TikTok that he was running for his life from rioters. He basically was streaming of the riots and following them around in Derby, has been jailed for 3 months. Where is it going wrong so badly that we have such shocking cases of child sexual abuse where these people aren't going to jail, and yet online hatred laws are locking people up for months, years at a time?
There are expensive TV lawyers out there doing a great deal of work to protect the wrong person, and the only thing that they're doing is lining their pockets. And in this case, we can see that clearly. The only winners here are the lawyers. In this case, because certainly not the children are being protected. Social media is very damaging to lots of conversations, as is lack of education on the reality of what a child endures after abuse has happened. You're talking about an underdeveloped child. I am the founder of a charity called Project 9010. A lot of the work that we're doing is researching how children are developing. I also work with young people in the performing arts, and I know from the 25 plus years of working with children how children are developing. Now, you're looking at children from say 3 or 4 years old to 8, 9 years old, where they're really sort of understanding creativity, how their brains are working, how they can develop with team and develop themselves with communities of people, friendships, and seniority. Now, during that time, if you have any abuse from there, then it takes all of that away from you. If you go into sort of the next stage of young teens, and you're taking a child's life through those years, you're taking away a very complex development for young people, and then you're going into your teens, into your early 20s, very confused. Your brain hasn't developed. You've had a lot of things taken from you as a child, and now you've got to be an adult. Now, if we really start looking at how a child develops and how they respond and how they go into young adults, into maturity, you will see that abuse strips lives. And that is the education that is majorly lacking from cases such as this today with the Edwards case. And that's what we need to refocus the attention on. It has to be about the victim. It has to be about the child. The work that I'm doing is about educating children, helping them to develop with their, awareness, how to communicate, how to understand when to query what's right or what's wrong. So we don't have these cases where Huw Edwards and others can find their way into society to manipulate, groom, and abuse.
And in some of the cases you've worked in, how does it come about that these children are groomed? Does it work on an individual basis? Are there sort of coordinated profiles that groom children?
Every case is different. From experience, I can tell you I was a vulnerable child, which made it very easy for me to be groomed and abused. A lot of the cases I have worked on, I would say it has been vulnerable children that have been attacked in this way with the grooming before the abuse starts. Because from my experience, I was, I guess, putty in the hands of my abuser or abusers, and they drew on my weakness, which was the vulnerability. I also know that abusers drew on my love of animals and my keenness to be around animals, and therefore they used animals. I mean, it was a real cliche in that respect, but it was animals. But also, abusers are often known to their victim. And that is where my 90-10 statistic comes in. 90% of children being abused are being abused by people that they know. And the 10% that we still educate children on at schools is around stranger danger. And that is totally unbalanced statistic.
And Emma Jane, I hope you don't mind me asking a few more questions about your own experience. Did you know at the time that you were being abused that what was happening was wrong?
No, I was a child. You don't know. You don't know. You're a child. I was 9 years old when I was first attacked. And then I was maybe 11, 12 when the grooming process the second time happened. But that was also during a very vulnerable time of my own personal life. And the person who abused me was a friend to the family, and so was hidden, right, hidden in plain sight. So effectively, that my abuser abused people around me, which is quite often the case that you will come across if you have these conversations with anyone who's gone through abuse. Families are abused, people around the child will be abused, so it goes unnoticed, and quite often people find it hard to even believe that that person could do such a thing, such an awful thing. But unfortunately for me, that was the case.
And at what age did you, or at what point rather, did you realise that something was wrong? And is that when all of the knock-on consequences, such as eating disorders, etc., started to manifest?
I think I was around maybe 15, 16 when I realised what was right and what was wrong. I was also underdeveloped as a child because I'd had so much taken from me as a child, which made it very hard for me to process the reality maybe of what was happening. And that's another common conversation. So yeah, I was around 14, 15 when I realised what was right or wrong. The insecurities, the vulnerabilities, everything got deeper and more complex and darker for me. So alas, the eating disorders for me was they became coping mechanisms, ways to cope: drink, drugs, eating disorders, you know, doing anything that I could just to escape from my world. But actually, that was the worst thing I was doing. I really needed someone to sort of help me, to talk to me. And that was maybe the hardest thing from people around me. I'd gone from good child to totally outrageous child and out of control child, and no one knew what to do with me, not even my schools. I was thrown into psychiatric care, being labelled a juvenile delinquent when I was anything but. I was thrown into report, put into isolation at school. So I had to spend my days with the headmistress or the deputy head. And that's how I lived my life for the last few years, because that was the only way they could control me. But really, all I needed was someone to really just say, are you okay? What's going on? Or just to talk to me, have some empathy, have some understanding. But instead of which, they just kept throwing things at me. I was the failure. I was going nowhere. Threw me out of school. That's not what I needed. I needed nurturing. I needed love. I needed care. I needed empathy. I needed someone to talk to. And it's really why everything that I do around my volunteer role as campaigning and in charity is really wrapped around the understanding of the realities and throwing in the real education that children need today. We're in the 21st century. We are still stuck in archaic education systems, which are great, but they're not enough today.
And just to finally ask on what happened to you, what happened to your perpetrators?
I was not confident enough to speak out about my perpetrators, and I was not confident enough to have spoken about them in my late teens, early 20s, when I could have done something about it. My family know and were very supportive, and stood by me whichever way I wanted to go. But I think the reality is we were all unsure of what to do, so therefore we did nothing. And I think, again, so many people are the same. They're too scared to speak out, so you do nothing. Very few people do speak out. Very few cases do come to court, and then you get people want to go forward, and then you hear what happens to Edwards, and you think many people will be like, oh my goodness, if I'd have gone down that route, then, that would have been a horrific outcome to see the perpetrator walk free. So therefore people say nothing, and that's why this has to change. And now, as a 52, I'm now 52, as a 52-year-old woman, I would absolutely encourage anyone to speak out. But with 52, I'm braver than I was at 16 or even younger.
But I suppose the thing that's so terrifying for these children is what happened to you was kind of potentially before the time of social media. And these children are also, in Hugh Edwards' case, these children have taken photos of themselves. So then to speak out, you run all kinds of fears of, well, what's going to happen to these photos? Are they
Absolutely.
all circulating the internet? And the shame behind that must silence them as well.
I was a young performer, and I was involved I was a professional young performer because dancing is my background, and I was involved in various situations when I was younger that I know photographs were taken, and I don't know where they are. They probably made their way to the dark web, sadly, and maybe one day they'll show up on social media. It's why I put things out before anyone else these days, because I think I've got no shame anymore, right? No one can shock or shame me in my life. I'm happy to put it all out there in case anyone does. But yeah, I mean, to have stuff circling the social media today, young people around the dark web as it is, and getting worse and worse and worse. I don't know where it's going to end. I think it's just sad, dangerous, and very scary at the moment.
Emma Jane, are you across at all what happens to child sexual abusers if they do escape a jail sentence? We understand that Hugh Edwards has a suspended sentence, so he's not completely escaped justice. He's also been put on the sexual offenders register, and he's been asked to take part in a sexual offenders treatment program. And this was decided based off of a sexual offender predictor tool by the prosecution service, which maybe you could speak about. I don't really know how they work those sorts of things out. What do you know happens to these?
I'm rolling my eyes at the sex offender tool, predictive tool, what to do with them, because that is just utterly ridiculous. And if that is how they're measuring this sentence or reality, then the world is much crazier than I thought it was in the first place. So regarding the programs and what Edwards has to take next, it's empty, right? It's an empty sentence. It means nothing. You only have to look at some of the cases that have gone before Hugh Edwards and what's going to come afterwards. It's all about that person. It's never about the victim. And we have to keep coming back to the reality of this case and every case around it. It has to be about the victim. Edwards, as I understand it, worked throughout a lot of this time, and I believe is being asked to hand his money back. I don't know where that case has got to on that, but how can you do a sex abuse a predictive tool to sentence? I mean, I don't know. I'd have to see what that looks like, but I don't believe it's a good gauge at all. And I think that's where the sentencing needs to get tougher. If you're going to take a child's life in this way, in the way that we just discussed, and the realities of the fallout, there has to be a bare minimum of sentencing, and that isn't 6 months suspended because he's going to go home, he's going to have a cup of tea, he'll go into some rehabilitation. Is it going to change the fact that what he's done? No. Is it going to bring the life back to the child? No. And that's where we've got to keep going back to. It has to be about the child, the victim, and the person who suffered, and also the family of that victim, right? I mean, they're going to have to support the child involved, and they will need support to support the child. When you look at my case, and we're talking back in the 80s, 90s, there was no support. So where is that support for the families? That is really urgently needed. Just going back to the sex offender register, if I may. The sex offender register. We've just seen a case where Steven van der Velde, an Olympic Dutch volleyball player, was on the child sex register here in the UK and he went on to glory at the Olympics. So actually, what do these sex registers mean? I know it was the Olympics and it was a different, a different country, but actually we need to make this a much more global. We need to unite, really. If you've got sex offenders anywhere in the world and you're going to other countries to work or perform or whatever, that we need to have visibility on that before those things happen, because actually we shouldn't see Van der Velde being celebrated at the Olympics. I understand, there are other cases where, abusers are being seen because of their profession in the entertainment world. Absolutely no way is that acceptable.
I suppose it's sort of a two-sided coin here, because in some cases one could say Hugh Edwards, being such a high-profile person, part of the punishment is that what you once had national treasure status, you are completely recognisable by everyone. His reputation is completely in tatters. He probably would feel afraid to walk around the street, and perhaps in some might say that actually that is serving time, even being out of jail. Whilst on the other side of the coin, do you think that in some cases, because he had this national treasure status, lots of people jumped to defend him, when in other cases, if it was someone else who didn't have a status that he had, people would immediately jump to other conclusions?
Totally, all of that, actually. This social media frenzy, the fact he's high profile and what a nice guy, I used to watch him when I did the news, is absolutely an awful look at someone who has abused a child. And that's where we need to get back to. He abused a child. Good. I hope he's suffering somewhere, somehow. I hope he struggles to walk around the streets. And I hope he gets the help he needs so he doesn't reoffend. But that's as much as I hope for that man, is that he doesn't reoffend and he gets the help that he needs to stop him to do that. How his life plays out around that is of no interest of me. My interest will always be on the victim, the child that suffered, and the fallout that these conversations cause, in that they will greenlight more difficult conversations for children and abusers watching on.
Lastly, Emma Jane, in the report, it says that there was 337 sexual images found on his phone, of which 41 were indecent images of children. I just wonder if you could talk about what advice you might have, having worked in this field, for parents who, if they're watching this, they might be terrified that their child, when they're on their phones late at night, are being groomed or getting into situations where they don't have the right guidance. What can parents do to make sure that their child is protected? And if they then get into trouble, how can parents help them?
Well, firstly, let's not let's not shine over the fact that that was a lot of indecent images and a lot of abuse. And again, go back to the reality that this Edwards has had a slap on the wrist with a feather in this case. As for what can parents do, well, look, if you are a parent with a child who has a phone, then there needs to be open dialogue. There needs to be conversations about what's right, what isn't right, understand what it means to share information. Social media is targeted for 14-year-olds and over. I think Snapchat might be younger. Don't quote me on that. But if you're sharing anything about yourself online, you got to know that that can be screenshot and shared on, screenshot and shared on, screenshot and shared on. It doesn't take much. I mean, it doesn't take much for one picture to start in the UK and end up in Australia within about half an hour. And that's the reality of what social media has done to the world of the underworld for child abuse images as these ones. So if you have a child, you need to talk to your child. You need to help them understand the reality of that. Any conversation, any picture, anything that you're doing and sharing is very easily transferable. And also, you're talking about children who are underdeveloped. Most adults I know don't even know how to use social media. And then you're giving a very powerful tool. Like I say, you and I could have this conversation. I could screenshot this and it could be in America and Australia within about 30 seconds. So, the reality of where your pictures could end up is huge. Personally, I would I don't think I think it's an issue to check your child's phone if you have any concerns. And why wouldn't you? They're under 16. You would check conversations that they're having. You would check writing that they might be doing if you're worried about them. Obviously, children need privacy, but if you have any concerns about how your children are developing with technology, help them, talk to them, see things, go through things, that there is no secrets. Keep it open lines of communication so no child gets hurt. Help them to talk about it with their friends. Have charities in who talk about the underworld, the online world. Have people in speaking about things at your schools. Encourage your schools to get them in, because quite currently right now PSHE is a few times a year. I mean, I do it a few times a year at school, and it ticks a box, right? But it's not changing, and it needs to change for protection to really happen for children.
Emma Jane Taylor, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.